I must look really weird. I feel really weird with all of this stuff clipped to me. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It kind of makes me feel quite old. With it sounded like a lot, and it is a lot. It's my, I've been a practicing architect for almost 20 years. So, and that's, spread out over that period of time. I don't know where you got it all from, actually, but yeah, it was very nice to hear it all, like talking about my backstory. I tried to come here last year, and I think my option at the time was to deliver a lecture on teams, and I couldn't face it. So if anyone kind of suffered that fallout, I kind of apologise, but it's really nice to have finally made it over here to talk to you about my work. I think what's maybe a bit of a slight, I don't know if I'd call it an irony, but I look, when I see my work and I look at my Instagram account, I can imagine that, you might think that there's something very kind of accurate about the way I produce work, and in some ways there is. I'm always very determined to describe my work in a very particular way, to draw out some conclusions. But actually I think what you'll find when you listen to me talk about my work is that, there's lots of plates spinning all the time, and there's a lot that the studio processes in order to kind of get to that position. So what I've done, I'm going to try and talk for 45 minutes, because I do think people fall asleep after 45 minutes, no matter how interesting the work is. You look like a fabulous architectural audience. You're beautifully dressed, you're all wearing beautiful tones. I feel very intimidated. So the way I've structured the lecture, I'm going to talk about my backdrop, because architecture and my studio is really a formulation of everything that I've done, things that people come into the office and what they bring. Everything is sort of slowly rolling into a kind of idea that I'm trying to develop about the practice. I don't think anyone really gets to the point where you can say definitively this is what I do, because I think everything is changing all the time. But there are some threads that you'll see sort of run through a number of projects, and reasons for certain details and certain decisions from previous projects. They sort of flow through into subsequent projects. So I guess what I thought I might do is talk about the things that have really interested me and have influenced me over the last 20 years. So as Sue Grimm has said, I set up practice in 2004 with this kind of very strong idea that I would run a business. Architecture, I do believe you should be able to run a practice and make money, have money in the bank, employ people, and they should have lovely lives and pay their mortgages. And you shouldn't need to subsidise your life and your work outside of that. It should be a profession equal to any other. That practice, I was in that practice co-director with Joe Morris for almost 14 years. And we accept any client that walked in the door. We said, yes, we'll do it, we'll build it. And we found some interesting pursuits within those projects. Some, as you will all know, are projects that you need to accept and deliver, and others sort of turn into projects that are really interesting. And I would say, to kind of very long story short, that in that time frame, I learnt a lot, but there were high points. And I would say that the high points came out of the projects that we kind of entered into very green. So this is a swimming pool project. Had never designed a swimming pool before. Had never designed it in this particular way, and I probably wouldn't design it in this way again. And that's not because it's wrong, but because we kind of embarked on a kind of idea about this project that was in the end quite complicated to procure. But this is a picture that I show a lot, because this is my nephew in this swimming pool, and this swimming pool sat on a greenfield site, within a secondary school for girls with modern learning difficulties. And the swimming pool had to do lots of things that would default to sort of very technical kind of concerns to do with the temperature of the swimming pool, the fact that the floor needed to move up and down, etc., etc. But we managed to procure this lovely structure out of a series of pieces that sort of broke down into a kit of parts. But the story I love most about this project is my sister's son hated swimming, and I said, "Oh, I'm designing a swimming pool, you must come, you must come." And it's, you know, his problem with swimming pools was noise, and I managed to get him to this swimming pool, and he genuinely, this sounds like a really show-off story, but he genuinely completely changed his mind about swimming when he went to this pool, and, you know, kind of understood that not all pools were noisy, full of bullies, but they had this kind of wonderful acoustic environment. So I'm not showing off about the fact that this changed his mind, but I do believe that architecture needs to do that. You know, you need to have a very specific idea that your projects are going to change something, change the way someone might experience it. And, you know, the other story that I tell about this one is it's a project that when we decided that it was going to be a kind of a series of folded truss roof structure, we made it in the studio out of a series of components. And I remember the guy, Grant, that was working with us at the time, making this, getting the pieces CAD cut, constructing it on the table, 1 in 50 or whatever it was. And it kind of translated to exactly that, so that the model was almost translated to a kind of one-to-one fact that, you know, we built the scheme in these series of giant components that came to site, were craned in, and the entire superstructure was constructed in a week. So, you know, the kind of closeness of the model, the making of the model, and the kind of act of construction is something that really interests me. Another project that I do reference a lot is this one. And this is perhaps, you know, I like this project, but it's not the thing that kind of I struggle with working in London. And, you know, I come to Norway and Oslo, and I just love how light and clean and sort of lively and vibrant the architecture is, and how the history sits with contemporary architecture. In London, you kind of, the history is a really heavy weight, and you struggle. I don't know how many of you have worked in London, but there is a kind of it's a very static part of London. It's very difficult to manipulate and sort of flex within the world of history that exists. It's sort of very steep, and you kind of end up in a place where you're talking about the history more than you are about the contemporary architecture. So this is a scheme, the new building, hopefully you can spot it, is the kind of very light building that's sitting on top of what once was 3 domestic properties, and then we cut out the base to introduce a shop front, and essentially we were turning a domestic property into a commercial space. And what we wanted to do originally, just, you know, just taking a kind of more intuitive position, a very broad observation of the street, which is a series of independent structures. We wanted to take out the middle section and build a new building from scratch. And we felt that perhaps that was how the architecture was speaking to us. Set aside the fact that the domestic buildings are actually very low grade in quality and didn't particularly suit the new programme that we're introducing. But we weren't allowed to do that because, you know, somehow the local authority, the conservation team decided that what we needed to do was preserve the architecture, preserve the sort of condition of the urban block, its weight, its density, its sort of meaning. So, okay, we kind of went with that. But actually, it's sort of annoying because, you know, as sort of described here, it's a lie. What we actually found was that this facade had been cut away and propped up numerously over a period of years. So we had to build this enormous structure to retain the brick, put the new building on the top. And, you know, whilst on one level it does communicate that there's history, we cut a deep set loggia in the top left to reveal the depth of the warehouse building next to it. It isn't really doing conceptually what the kind of local authority really wanted us to achieve. Another kind of anecdotally, this is a project that we worked on. It was an extension to actually not an extension to the Saatchi Museum on King's Road. It was a cafe pavilion that would sit adjacent to it and sort of attach and fuse to this historic wall. And it's the sort of programme that you brief. The briefs are kind of often talk about, introducing a new public realm, how you might attach a different type of programme to it above and beyond drinking coffee. And we decided that maybe there's a kind of different way that we could perhaps talk about the architecture by engaging with 3 artists. So this is the pavilion that we designed on the left, and one of the artists we spoke to is Angela de la Cruz. She's a Spanish architect, very well known, artist, very well known. And this was one particular structure, which is a crumpled piece of canvas that sort of sits in a space that she talked very eloquently about through her interpreter. And this is another piece that she's made on the top left, which was when we went to visit her in her studio, she was making a whole series of sort of structures that started out as, Judd-like, if you like, these very pure aluminium rectilinear structures that she then deformed, and she applied material coatings to them. And actually what we found interesting in a dialogue with her about them was that they have a particular presence and a particular quality from afar. You kind of make certain assumptions about them. They evoke, particular memories about things. And then as you get closer, the detail and the texture within those surfaces start to speak of something else. So that was something that interests us. The artist on the bottom left was Germaine Cruip. I'm probably pronouncing that badly, but the discussion we had with her was very much to do with thresholds. So this is a piece that she produced, I think it was in the Frieze 2014, where it was a digital installation, but what she did was she recorded and digitized the kind of motion of the movement through this corridor, and she played back the shadow in a different place. So you're very much aware of your movement through this structure. And that sort of promoted a discussion or about the threshold condition. How would we talk about the entrance to this pavilion? Where would the threshold actually sit between the public realm and the structure itself? And then the artist on the right is probably one that you might know more, is Peter Liversidge. He does lots of really, quite incredible work, but he's kind of got this ongoing series of typewritten letters which try to project an idea about something that might happen in the future, and he sort of constructs what you might describe as a memory about something. So he talked about this pavilion as potentially at some point in the future being a space where it might host food festivals. So all those things sort of bound together. Sorry, this is an unusual side, the image on the left. We kind of took that dialogue with those artists and tried to construct an architecture out of that. So not something that was sort of driven singularly by programme, by area, by the architecture that existed in the context. And then I suppose the opposite to that. So that's a kind of architecture that comes out of dialogue and words, and a kind of strong idea about material language, and a kind of another emerging sort of pavilion typology, if you like, is a pavilion that might promote some sort of activity. So this was a project that we worked on for competition. Actually, we didn't win either. We didn't win either of them. But tried to find a space in a square again that would invite a range of activities and might sort of construct a community or a reaction. So it was a series of tabletops at different levels, that the lower creating a sort of more intimate space, to to a sort of space that might invite a particular arrangement, so a performance in one area and an audience constructed in the other. So a structure that might operate in a small and a larger scale. And this, I'm still in the reflection part and I'm keeping my eye on the time, but this is a building house that I designed for myself, which I'll talk again about later, which became, you know, it's one of my big question marks about architecture actually, and it's, you know, when do you actually consider architecture as an object, as a piece that sort of works in its own right in kind of quite a selfish way. You know, what's the piece of work am I producing, and when does it become part of the outside? You know, when is it something that's just seamlessly sort of woven into its context? And this is an image of I'm going to pronounce it very embarrassingly now with Duggan here, but it's a photograph that someone I went to Iceland with took of the Sjávarlaga Trail, pronounced incorrectly, and it's something that I look at a lot because I think that architect should always go away from buildings. If you get the opportunity to go to a place where you're not looking at buildings, it helps you reflect, because I think we're a very strange, it's a strange profession. I think I struggle with the fact that I can't really go. You can't stop looking at things. You can't stop looking at door handles. You can't stop looking at details. It's kind of quite hard to shut down and kind of process. And so this, you know, so on one level I shut down, but on the other, you know, I constantly find that I look at materials and colour and landscape and sort of wonder why there isn't more of that in architecture, and why we sort of sometimes we come down to the sort of bare essentials, which is, you know, bricks, wood, whatever it is, and you know, outside of that there's all this, and there's all this colour and science and chemistry and these beautiful textures that sort of come out of materials that exist around us, but somehow we can't use them. Somehow they don't make it into architecture in the way that they're so visible. And this is just an image of it's a coincidence. The image on the left, we were trying to develop a colour palette for a particular master plan we were working on. So we'd taken a series of swatches from a series of photographs, and we were just adding pigments to coffee cups. I'm sure you all do it. And that same weekend, this is a picture of a trough, a stone trough in my friend's farm, full of pebbles, sort of just there, beautiful colours, you know, effortless, already made. So, you know, what do you do? You know, I'm not telling you these things because I love them. I kind of want to take them and I want to make them mean something for the studio and for the architecture that I'm sort of trying to produce. So this is one project, which is one play structure from it was a playground proposal where we introduced a number of circular structures to deal with a long linear play area. And we decided that we wanted to make this structure out of concrete, but add a series of colours and textures that we then expose the aggregate on the surface. So what you see here, as I described at the beginning, is sort of a complete project, but actually in the background there was a lot of testing, there was a lot of ingredients that were added to the materials, formwork, etc., and then a kind of process of sanding it and understanding and seeing and witnessing and doing and trying to sort of, in a way, through the making process, experience what the sort of patination, how that might start to show. And I suppose collections of things, you know, again, it's almost impossible to go anywhere to look at sculpture and not see architecture, to look at sort of material and colour and composition and not translate that to kind of different scales that might be relevant in a kind of master plan context or in a kind of smaller scale project. Sorry. Another project, sort of more recent, but I have completely lost track of time because I don't know where. The last 2 years is just a blur. This was a exhibition that we took part in that invited 55 architects to develop a model which would be an interpretation of one of the chapters from Calvino's Invisible Cities. We took this chapter which talked about Euphemia, and Euphemia being a place where the 5 nations would gather and talk within a kind of talk about commerce, talk about trading, talk about gossip, and a kind of idea that materials and spices would be exchanged in a forum. But the text doesn't talk about architecture, it talks about people, and it talks about exchange, and it talks about economy. And what the exhibition invited the architects to do was to just sort of perhaps, or at least our version of it, was to kind of understand perhaps your discipline as an architect. You know, we're in a battle, we do very technical things, but we do very creative things. Some architects, we like to call ourselves artists, but we wanted to kind of go through this process of understanding the text and see what journey the text might take us on to produce a piece of work. So, and it was weird, and it will probably sound weird now as I describe it, but we wanted to build something that might be kind of a kind of representation of the text, but might enable us to sort of translate a kind of idea about materials and how the materials might start to dictate a set of decisions about a structure. So we made we kind of worked with the idea that there was spices talked about in the text, that there was an idea about candlelit evenings where conversation would take place. So we gathered a set of materials, and we made with wax, cardamom, spices, and various things, a kind of material form. This was a sort of the first go at an idea about what the sculpture might start to look or be made of, not look like. And then we sort of took perhaps quite a literal journey, and we made this. We wanted somehow to describe the 7 nations, we wanted to describe the materials, and we constructed 2 forms, one being, you know, reminiscent of perhaps an amphitheatre, but with a volume within its sort of descent, shown here, that would perhaps be in exact volume, the dimension of the wax column which stood beside it. And this was the piece that we constructed in the end, which sits, you know, for us, you know, we kind of went round and round in circles with it and made circles with it, but we in the end felt that we described something that sort of sat between something that was kind of wholly architectural with this column and this amphitheatre, but somehow sat in this sort of strange place between sort of text and architecture. And then just a few quick projects that take kind of stronger ideas about the density of materials and how you might start to bring that into kind of an architectural configuration which might talk more about kind of geology. This is a building in Somerset, a new house which sits on the most amazing listed listed farm actually, and the brief that we took from our client was to construct a new house, refurbish various elements, but to a very specific attitude about the house being a contemporary house. There was a previous planning permission for a very pastiche building. But you know, as a project, a kind of blue sky project, in the sense that we're out of London, we've got amazing landscape, we've got no immediate architecture from which we need to take reference, and also Somerset being the site itself, fantastic texture and material, and Somerset full of quarries and stones that we could salvage. So the project actually evolved into an architectural programme, which I'm sure is very legible: a central hallway with a series of bedrooms and living rooms and kitchens extending beyond it. But we kind of imagined it as a piece of geology from which we would construct from the material within the land around, extracted from the quarries, and we developed this sort of marbled, an idea about a kind of marble texture, whereby the base of the structure would start as a sort of from concrete foundations, but we would slowly add textures that would be gathered from the quarries and treated in a particular way. And this was an emulated sample, but one that we worked up with a concrete specialist at the time. I'll keep going. So I suppose what interests, this is a picture. This is that project sitting in the studio on the shelf. Architecture, you know, there are perhaps a very obvious moment, but briefs take you in very different directions. So the project at the bottom we conceived as a heavyweight building that would be part of the site, immersed in and it was evolved from the geology. The project at the top is the project that Seagram referred to, which is the Science Museum. And this was a brief that, you know, might be and I think another architect would have had a very different response to it, because what it actually is, it's not a publicly accessed space, but it was a space right at the top of the Science Museum that had been used historically to display very unusual sort of medical, historic exhibition space. And the Science Museum realised that this could function and generate significant revenue as two event rooms. So a sort of a brief that invited us to find a language or an approach or an aesthetic, if possible, to accommodate 4 different room typologies. So they wanted these 2 spaces to function in this way, as a sort of education forum or a conference centre. They wanted it to function as an award space, an exhibition space. And so our approach, very difficult to find, you know, to essentially design a blank space that needed enough material in it to both change it, but without it, you know, it's in between state, or it's a kind of blank room with lots of furniture, just sort of feeling lost in that space. Or when it functioning as a kind of an award space, that there would be an area that was unused and it would feel oversized for its particular function. So this was a kind of, you know, this is a form of architecture that we felt needed kind of quite an intense sort of, it was an intense technical challenge. So we discovered there was a space frame at the top of this building that we wanted to expose and utilise to conceal all of the kit that you need: lighting, theatre lighting, maintenance lighting, air handling. And then we would somehow create a room that would allow the user and the events team to sort of intuitively set out different kinds of functions that would need to change over in, sometimes hours. Those arrangements would change. So essentially it's a floor, a resin floor, and a whole suite of flexible curtains. So the circle in the middle was representative of an area that would be needed, so 250 people could sit and dine. And the circle at the top was an area, so you can imagine that there would be an auditorium layout with a projection on the top wall. And then, a sort of wedding venues with pianists at the front with these amazing views out to the city. And sort of in doing that, I think, again, just trying to find the right references that might sort of inspire those sorts of decisions. So this is a drawing by OAF Forelesning, and sort of trying to think about how art might start to influence that programme. And this is a whole series of slides of that space, with the curtains, all of the IT set into the frame, and you can just about see the different resin colours set within the floor. And then just sort of finally, in this sort of very fast track first sequence, this is an exhibition for the Barbican Arts Centre, an exhibition where we displayed 333, I think, was the final count of Dorothea Lange's photographs. She was an amazing documentary photographer. She documented the American Depression period. I suppose, we've gone from something very quickly, a sequence of projects. One is kind of really intensely material-led, an obsession about materials. The second is sort of trying to understand how you make a good space out of let's say, a brief that perhaps might not necessarily lead you there. How do you take that and make it interesting? And this one is, an exhibition. I'd actually never worked on a kind of exhibition design before, but with this one, we just got completely obsessed with her character. And, on one hand, with exhibitions, they're an opportunity to design beautiful structures into which objects and art would be displayed. But because this was kind of singularly a series of her artwork, her photography, we felt quite strongly that perhaps because of the nature of the work, because it depicted, depression. So this is an image of two children in a trailer moving from one kind of area to the other with all of their worldly possessions, a kind of rolled up piece of vinyl, waiting to sort of find a new home. That we felt that somehow this exhibition needed to try and capture that mood. And I guess it's a hard thing to do. It's hard with exhibitions not to be so literal about these things. But we thought that we could do this by being kind of deliberately simple about the materials and frugal. So we wanted, the curators were very specific about the exhibition, really needing to describe her journey, her life's work. And she started out life in a very privileged place. She ran a portrait studio in San Francisco, but then when she had this sort of epiphany moment, she decided that she wanted to be a documentary photographer and shift her kind of position into a kind of more political, more of an activist. That's when the kind of intensity of the work really begins. So what we did was we designed a series of structures, the first being, well-shaped, complete, beautiful, beautifully laid out series of her early portrait works. And then as the exhibition goes on, a series of units start to sort of dematerialise, and we start to show the kind of frugality of materials and just only introduce and use the components that are kind of necessary to display the work. So that's a series of units moving from the complete to the incomplete. And this is sort of a series of slides. You can see another one, perhaps, again, a kind of closer reference to what we're talking about, you know, someone just existing with the very basic architecture, which would have been literally constructed from pieces that would have been salvaged from their own home. And this is an image of the first in that sequence of galleries where the work is kind of very carefully and curated and displayed in a more formal arrangement. So that was a kind of possibly too fast and maybe not enough of the right words said. But the second part of my studio is an idea about how the other struggle I have, I suppose, is I think as architects functioning within the construction industry, procuring buildings in the way that we do, we tend to talk to engineers and QSs and environmental people, and we talk about numbers and science a lot. And I think that has its place, obviously. That's how you make buildings. But I also kind of can't work out how, when you're doing that, so that's, you know, my version of that is the diagram on the left. You know, what comes into that? What else influences it? And I don't think it's just looking at other architects' work, because we're in this sort of cuddle, aren't we, in this very closed loop. So what I wanted to do when I set up my new practice is to maybe find other interests that were genuinely attached to the practice, not hobbies, not going home and reading books, but to see if other creative disciplines within the field that we know and we work in could actually operate within the same space and influence the way that we work. So my idea was to set up a residency program. This is Mirandi's studio. Within that kind of same discussion, I suppose, I'm interested in him not because his work talks about composition, light and colour, and we're interested in that as architects, but I find the way that he worked and the way that he used and collected objects and painted them in different ways really fascinating. So so what he did is he lived in Bologna in Italy with his 3 sisters, looked after them, but he worked in and slept in this studio, and he would collect these artifacts from various markets and that he would visit within Italy, never left Italy. But these pieces are the pieces that appear in all of his work. And within the work, if you look, they're all rearranged and displayed, and they're all painted differently. And I'm sort of fascinated by, that his apparatus, the tools that he uses are tools from sort of, you look at that, and as architects, we see architecture, we see composition, we see beautiful colours, but that, he was looking at architecture whilst he's drawing these things. So he's describing many different things through these sort of very particular tools, his tools. So that's a slide of Barbara Hepworth's gallery in Cornwall. So the first resident I invited in was a ceramicist called Cara Guthrie. And I suppose what I deliberately didn't do was say, "Hi, come and take a seat in my studio and let's collaborate." What I wanted to do was have her working in the studio, delivering her own work, her own program, but sort of, we'd come together at moments when, there was some common ground, or we'd introduce her into discussions and we'd find an interesting dialogue. And that sounds vague, but it was really interesting. It worked. So this is the project that I've just described to you. which might make a bit more sense now. At the time we were talking about it being made from the land on which it stands and how we might do that. We were speaking to concrete specialists and we were kind of understanding where the quarries were and how we might use those materials and pour them into moulds and mix them. She was in the studio at that time and she was sort of developing her own different glazing methods. So she came in and she had a wheel and she was churning pots all day long whilst we were clicking in and out on, you know, and making phone calls. But so what was interesting was her production and our production, which were very different, but she was sort of making pots at a very different pace to our making architecture. You know, we're talking seconds and years. But the tone of the wheel, the way that she was, her production, you know, the fact that we could smell clay and we were drawing bricks, you know, there was something interesting about those two conditions overlaid. But in the context of this particular project, which she decided to do, we were talking about stones and stones being an additive and forming this marbled facade on this building. She went to the site, she camped, she collected organic materials, hawthorns, all sorts of materials, and she reduced them down to an ash and made it into a paste, and she developed this sort of marble texture to her vessel, which is photographed upside down on the left. So two sort of parallel journeys. You know, this isn't ours and that isn't ours. These are two separate projects, but somehow they've kind of, you know, the Venn has found it a sort of place for both to exist. And then another project, so that's a series of pieces that she made with us on the left for that project, the Averys. And then the project on the left was a school that we were designing, which, you know, magically we got a planning permission for a poured pink concrete building, which unfortunately didn't move forward. But we were talking about, so that was a Jesmonite facade component or fragment, and we were trying to consider how the kind of base condition might feel for this was a middle school, girls' middle school, and how we might treat the base of that building. And we were talking, you know, at 1 to 100, you know, our vessel at that time was a 1 to 100 model. We were holding it in our hands. She was going through a similar process when she was making pots. So between us, we kind of came up with this sort of fluted detail, one kind of tactile at, you know, a scale, and hers more about how you might pick up and deal and hold a cup and give it some grip. So they were two quite nice. And this, you know, much simpler. This is a building on the left. It's a backland site in Walthamstow. Currently on site, the client's developing it independently. It's a self-build. And it's a series of very similar typology to the Averys, where it's a whole suite of rooms that sort of come together with very particular threshold conditions, a kind of living room, a kitchen, a bedroom. And at that time, she was sort of tracking that and following that project, and she developed this suite of trinkets that would kind of sit together but might also belong to each room independently of their own sort of scale and proportion and use. And then the second resident, I'm only going to talk about two of them. We've had a ceramicist, a fine artist, a bookmaker, poet, Nigel Peake, and more recently a composer. But this residency with Nigel was fascinating because of his character and the way he wanted to work, he wanted to do the opposite to the Saratskara, the ceramicist. He wanted to find a space in the studio. He wanted to be able to observe us, but he wanted to kind of go and hide away and draw. So he does the most amazing, these slides won't do his work any favours, pencil drawings. He works with lots of materials, but during this period he was using coloured pencils. So he sat in in a cupboard, actually. That's what he wanted to do, but it was a cupboard with a window. And he was sort of listening, so he does really interesting things with words. He can sort of take a word and make it a drawing, and sort of enjoys the seeing and not seeing. So he would look at models, he would listen to conversations, and he created a whole series of really beautiful drawings with, you know, generally 8 layers of pencil, so there would be one layer, and then there might be another layer, and the grain and the sharpen and the number of pencils that just would go into one piece was really quite incredible. You know, if you could imagine a drawing as a kind of 3-dimensional piece, I think this is probably as close as you could get to it. But again, the tone, the sort of tranquility, the colours, his sort of observations that were sort of running and very visible in tandem with our work were a really important influence. And all of the drawings talk about the projects that are live in the office. So it took us some time to work through them, and in some cases he had to tell us what they were. But this one is one project called the Averys, and there was a whole sequence of them that had a very particular meaning to him and to us. But what he did, which was quite clever, he said, perhaps, you know, if this is going to be a true dialogue, and I'm here and I'm influencing you, and likewise maybe you could take a drawing each and produce something, you know, really quickly, a kind of architectural reaction to those drawings. And that's what we did. So this is Nigel Peake, this is Will Guthrie, one of my employees at the time. He took that drawing and he cleverly made some polystyrene forms that were kind of emulant of this building, this drawing, read it as a perspective or a plan, and he made this triptych of casts. This is another one that another employee, Francesco Paini, made 2 pieces where he read this drawing as an elevation. We didn't know at the time, but it did happen to be something close to that in kind of Nigel's reading. And he created 2 pieces through working in sketches and CAD, and made 2 plaster casts. This was my one. I just read this immediately as a landscape. You know, my obsession with materials. I wanted to see if I could make this a material. So rather than make a cast of this, I decided to construct a formwork and set the formwork up in a particular orientation so I could set the grain against gravity. You know, that's something that is always in my head with materials. You're always kind of bound to horizontals, you know, bricks and mortar, and just the fact that materials fall to a base, whereas you carve a piece of stone from a quarry, you've got a very different texture and a very different condition. So that's what I decided to do, make this piece where, you know, there was a kind of thinking about generating a piece of material with a particular grain and a particular quality. And that's all of them. There were 10 of us in the studio at the time, and we all made a version in reaction to Nigel's work. So I've got 2 projects that I thought, you know, I might talk about. It's storytelling again. This is a project that it's a house on the left. I think I have 2 slides here. So it's a backland site. Backland, presumably, you know, it might be a London term, but it's a site that's wedged between 2, backwards and forwards, 2 Victorian rear gardens. So these are gardens coming into a wall at the top and cranked at the bottom. And the backland definition is it's a piece of land that sits perpendicularly to the Victorian gardens. So I actually bought this piece of land about 15 years ago and constructed this house that I lived in. And beautiful. You know, it was a very small house, 130 square meters, just about a 3-bed house, but with a very, you know, we all do. We all have our dream of building our own house, and you know, I can confidently say that the house that I dreamed about building for myself wasn't this, because I had a very particular reaction to the site when I visited the site, where it was, and what I would then do with it. So the kind of longer story, so I'll tell you a story about that. The longer story is I sold the house, and then a client of mine bought it, and he's the composer, and he wanted to live in the house, but he also wanted a separate studio. So this is the result of building the house. 8 years later, someone else coming back to me with my house and asking me to design something else, which is a kind of really odd and, you know, quite an emotional, very weird sort of thing to do. You know, I don't think it's very common to sort of revisit a project in that way. But it was good, because this is the house that I mentioned at the beginning. It was one that when I bought the site, I felt quite strongly that the conditions that existed were actually quite beautiful. You know, it was an overgrown site full of ivy, full of trees that had self-seeded, but it had this very particular quality, which was about this sort of leftover condition. You know, it said a lot about London, but the garden walls were actually quite a kind of well-established figure within this series of blocks. So the first house design was, the idea was that the two would accept the site, span 2 walls, east to west, and we would inhabit the building. So it was one single box fused to a 2-story box with a kind of gallery-like interior, central void, as much sort of sensible kind of passive decisions as possible. And within the raised and reconfigured walls, there would be niches into which we could sort of build pieces of furniture. So it was a lovely, simple solution, very low budget, and a house that I enjoyed living in for many years, and then kind of sold it on. But the reality of being in that house and living in it is what it did. What it actually became was a kind of extension of what it once was, which was this garden that became incredibly overgrown. And what actually happened was the walls did start to sort of recede as a sort of backdrop, as a sort of armature for landscape. And it became a place that talked more and spoke more of the landscape. They had this kind of beautiful quality late in the evening where the sun would set, and actually you barely see the interior, you're just looking directly into the garden. So when I embarked on the new project, so I've moved from seeing gardens, the understanding that there was a kind of wall condition which was more interesting, inserting these 2 new walls into which the kind of new house phase 1, but then through that process of living there, understanding what the garden would do. So, you know, I worked a lot on the garden. I knew that this back section, nothing would grow there. So when the studio idea was put to me, the kind of obvious position, you can see would be to extend here. But actually I knew that there were issues with the laneway, and that, you know, that this was a space that could easily be accommodated without impacting on the kind of surface area and the character of the courtyard. So that's what it became. And really my vision was this sort of idea that it wouldn't actually be architecture at all. It would be a beautiful landscape that could be occupied with a series of kind of bay windows and entrances and exits that would become part of that landscape. And this is the interior, you know, which, you know, in itself, it had its own very surprisingly bright interior, but a kind of strong idea that the internal textures would just talk very much about the simplicity of the the ground where the datum, where the levels were dropped. That's the sort of concrete substrate, steps down to a cast concrete floor, and a claymaster surface that very carefully navigates a series of roof lights that are configured in very specific places to suit a kind of position of microphones, and a kind of whole suite of a series of discussions around the setup for the studio. Sorry, I need a drink. But in that sort of kind of diminishing character, I suppose, of the brick and the architecture and this idea of an armature, came a kind of obsession about the garden and how details such as door handles will work. So this is a kind of crafted piece of stone. It's described as a push-pull handle. So you pull with your thumb and you push from the inside with your handle. There's a kind of green, very kind of formal external piece and a much softer handle to exit. But in the end, you know, for me, the architecture or the idea behind this building, there was the kind of very particular internal programme and the suite of joinery items that were tuned precisely to the composer's specification. But this idea that eventually the structure would sort of start to diminish within this kind of wall garden, become an extension of the wall garden, and there would be these sort of small details, sort of highly crafted moments that talk about the threshold condition, the entrance and exit decisions. And then finally, this is a competition which just won recently, actually. If you know London, you probably know Big Ben. Big Ben is north, kind of west of this image. The competition asked, so the Garden Museum is set within the palace grounds, so the kind of large black part of this Nolly plan is essentially Lambeth Palace, with kind of beautiful gardens threaded into a new structure designed by Dow Jones, which contains a beautiful cafe and an exhibition space. And the Garden Museum have been very clever about their own kind of demise, but understanding that, you know, as a garden museum, you know, the whole world with greening, that perhaps to communicate the ambitions of the Garden Museum and how horticulture can be kind of an educator, or the horticulture and gardening being a kind of visible part of the centre, that they would take the front existing garden and cultivate it themselves. So they're very cleverly in the background, before this competition started, have developed and become part of a much wider master plan that connects 3 significant green spaces, the embankment leading up to Westminster and Big Ben, a kind of beautiful community garden called Paradise Gardens south of this plan. But then in that sequence, sort of try to integrate 2 gardens and conjoin them into one space that connects those 2 together. But put simply, the brief wanted a new pavilion to host volunteers and a space for the gardeners who would service those two spaces to function. And a garden that would be alive with community activity, would become a picnic space for local workers and become a kind of weekend sanctuary to local residents. So I think, as the Nolly explains, what we felt quite strongly that perhaps a kind of independent floating pavilion structure was the wrong answer, because the Garden Museum wanted this to kind of announce an entrance, but at the same time the entrance would, the contents of the entrance pavilion would not host the general public. So our response to this was to kind of consider the structure as an extension to the kind of walled palace, and extend a kind of historic wall into a kind of railed wall, into a solid space that would host a kind of meet and greet. We were determined to not have a kind of open, very deliberate threshold that might invite a kind of, or inhibit, or perhaps suggest that the threshold was paid in any way, but rather it was free and completely democratic. And that perhaps the pavilion facilities would somehow, much like the kind of historic structures, it would somehow read as a sort of piece of architecture that was sort of fused to a wall, which would fortify the entire garden and kind of provide a kind of much softer edge to and presence to the garden within the configuration of the palace. So I suppose that came from a kind of idea that maybe the building might have a kind of strong sense of its materiality. These are two Egon Schiele paintings, but what we were interested in picking up on some of the ideas from Kingsgrove, that the building would have a kind of strong material presence, but would not necessarily have a kind of architectural quality that would try to find its place within the palace, but read as a suite of walls, and then within it there might be a kind of set of details that talked about the more intricate qualities, about how the building functions, how you might access it, how you might deal with the kind of more ergonomic gestures that existed within the historic detail. So the idea, the kind of the main idea was that we looked at dry stone walling, and we had a sense that the architecture might come from a kind of very primitive form of construction, but then also conscious of kind of how solid materials that might depend on cement might be potentially not the right kind of message to send out in a master plan that's talking about greening and kind of giving back oxygen. So, and looked at various dry stone wall systems that can be structural in the way that the stones are laid. They can sort of contain beautiful textures, but also would set up a kind of rhythm along the street through kind of indents that might set public alcoves in various places to invite in gardeners and to invite in the general public in a kind of with a very particular hierarchy. So, gosh, I'm really parched. So again, we've worked with the materials. So we gathered material that we felt that we could salvage from London. So the conceptually, we wanted to not bring in new material to this site, but rather try and document and find buildings within the city that are being demolished, and there are many of them, and the stone tends to get ground down, it goes into roads, it goes into substructure, and we've discovered that there are quite beautiful materials that get recycled in a way that sends them into places that are never seen. So our idea was to take these materials and to construct the walls from salvaged material from London. And working closely with a structural engineer, we discovered that these sorts of constructions, whilst they're described as precast and they contain concrete. You can take stones and you can bind them together with a kind of non-cement based pastes in various aggregations. And we discovered through a kind of very analytical process of considering the widths of the buttresses that would span and support the materials, that we could also take out the requirement for reinforcement. So these are the sort of sample models that we've made that contain a kind of idea of history. So we've created and designed a buttress wall that has a kind of heavier material at the base, bound together with a non-cement based aggregate. And then the kind of lighter grain materials go into the next layer, which is slightly thinner. And then as you go up, you introduce finer materials around window portals and etc. And I think, so the architecture is essentially formed from a series of buttress structures. On the inner side, we've kind of fused the horticultural facilities, but as you move around the walls within these sort of compartmented sections, we're salvaging material from London and reconstituting it within the sort of grounds of this garden. There's a whole sequence of studies that start to describe that. And this is the scheme as it currently stands, which is fortunately moving forward, where we've sort of fused or we're trying to describe a building that's both landscape, it sort of contains and replays history with kind of materials that are upgraded and formed into this new facility sitting on the kind of east side of the site. Okay, that's it. Sorry, it was got a bit rusty at the end.